Welcome to DiversiTV. This is our second show in a series of 8. Today we'll be looking at white folks or Anglo-Americans in our diversity pie, but just to give you a sense of where we're going, go to slide if you would, Randy. So our schedule, last week we started with natives. The reason being we're on Turtle Island, and that's the protocol that Afrocentric folks follow, is you go to the people whose land it is. And guess who's been here the longest? Homeland Security notwithstanding. Second, we go to Anglos because one of the things we want to look at is today is relieving the white man's burden. And so one of the things we look at in terms of that is we'll have to define what that is, but we'll get to that. Next week is African American because, yes, it's Black History Month, and also the next week after that will be Asian because of some of the projects that are going on here in Eugene with respect to remembrance of Asian American history. And that covers the people of the 4 directions, who we will define what that means a little bit later. But looking at the people of the 4 directions, who would also include the mixtures of all those 4 groups, would be Latino. So that would be the one after Asian, later in February. And then week 6, combining women, gender, GLBT, two-spirit issues, week 6. Week 7, disability. And week 8, youth. And then we'll break for spring break and start over with a new round of folks, either similar topics or continuing on in the category of diversity as LCC defines it, which goes beyond race and ethnicity to covering all kinds of differences, perceivable and imperceptible differences. Our focus today, we're trying to have conversations and questions I ain't seen on TV before, so I admit to a certain conservative radical bias with that. Don't call me a liberal, you might as well just, if you don't call me a liberal, just be straight and just call me an uppity nigga, because I think conservative radical is more descriptive, or uppity nigger is actually better than liberal. So, we start with the people of the 4 directions. Go to slide again. And then we look at the federal 5 race categories, because that comes out of whiteness and that whole definition of who's in, who's not, why are Arabs considered white. There's a whole history behind that. Where are other and who is other and all that kind of stuff. Native first, because we're on Turtle Island, as I said before. White folks next, because of the white man's burden. Black folks because of Black History Month. Asian because of that people of 4 directions status. People of 4 directions is a pre-Columbian racial construct that basically says that all the races are equal, and that the people of the East, the yellow race, the people of the South, the black race, people of the West, the red race, the people of the North, the white race. All they're equal. They all have their place on the medicine wheel. They all have their drum, except some natives have observed that white people seem to have lost their drum. And what happens when you lose your drum? Do you lose your way? Do you feel that you have to steal other people's technology because you've lost your heartbeat, your connection to the sacred, and to understand that everybody that you see is part of your family? What keeps you from doing that? So Latinos, back to slide, are a mixture of the people of the 4 directions and defined by the federal 5, i.e. whiteness. There's a reason why, for example, in the feet wet policy of Cuban immigrants, why Cubans who look like me get treated as Haitians and get sent back to Cuba, and light-skinned Cubans get to stay. They're both illegal immigrants, but the dark-skinned Cubans get sent back. So there's also a question about, with the illegal immigrant, 12 million illegal immigrant things, if there's 500,000 white folks that are illegal immigrants, who's looking for them? Ain't nobody. So we talk about the issue of white privilege, which our guests can definitely ably talk about. And then the last category is when we talk about gender, disability, and youth. because we had 8 weeks and you got to decide somewhere among all the multitudes of diversity where you're going to fit in. So we hit kind of the high points in terms of who, you know, we're not doing oppression Olympics here, but got to talk about somewhere, and we got the program. So we talk about the policies of the historical policies of manifest destiny, social Darwinism, and the white man's burden. So the idea of the 19th century doctrine saying that the United States was believed to have the God-given right to expand into and possess the whole of the North American continent. The Indians were an impediment to that. They had to go by. Social Darwinism, a discredited social theory stating that the political and economic advantages in a developed society are derived from the biological advantages of its collective, meaning white, membership. And for those of you who are a fan of the Jungle Book, Rudyard Kipling's famous poem basically expounding upon these policies, The White Man's Burden, which the dictionary defines as the supposed responsibility of Europeans and their descendants to impose their allegedly advanced civilization on the non-Caucasian original inhabitants of the territories they colonized, often considered an offensive term, but nonetheless, still policy. So a cartoon that went along with that, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This appeared with Kipling's poem in 1898. You will see a British explorer, but he's wearing a U.S., you know, he's part of the U.S., carrying a stereotypical black savage, big lips, you know, the hair and the grass skirt. You know, there's a dead white man next to him that's been killed by this savage, and the white man is carrying him up to the hill to the schoolhouse, as it were. Now there's another one where basically it shows that Uncle Sam riding on the back of a black person with the, you know, John Bull behind him, and, you know, another European behind him, a line of them riding on people of color, mostly black people, up to, okay, civilization, right? And of course another one, a little funnier, where you have Uncle Sam carrying these rude savages, mostly black character and others, and John Bull in the red, up the hill to civilization and justice, etc., etc. The white man's burden. So regardless of where you think these are right or wrong, politically correct, it is social policy for a number of folks. And so what our guest tonight will look at, Tim McMahon, who's a faculty development consultant in academic learning services, and Kodak, the Center on Diversity and Community at the University of Oregon. Chris Cullinan is the Training and Development Administrator in the Human Resources Department of the University of Oregon and a nationally recognized expert in the field of diversity. She's written an electronic essay entitled Vision Privilege and the Limits of Tolerance. Ruth Wren, our own at Lane Community College, is a writer and speaker here. She facilitates the City Club Racism Circles. She's the author of the essay, Everywhere I Go, I'm White, Facing the Responsibility of Privilege. Let's see. Don't have Judge Carlson, but she was invited. So our panelists were asked tonight to consider a number of questions. Hopefully we'll get to all of them. But it basically boiled down to, if I was being diplomatic, what would an egalitarian white culture look like? Let me go through all the questions and we can consider all of them and just freeform it. Can whiteness be betrayed towards a larger vision of humanity, like you all three of you admitted to being race traitors? So, can whiteness be betrayed towards a larger vision for humanity? I guess a simple answer would be yes. Or, how can you reform white culture to be non-discriminatory? Certainly, my guest last week had lots of opinions about that, and I'm sure people of color subject to the white man's burden might have an opinion about what that would be. But we decided to look at it from here. How can you deconstruct the support structures of white privilege and then reconstruct empowerment structures for a larger humanity? And then how you answer Bubba, who says, my ancestors didn't kill or enslave anybody. Why do I have to pay the price? Via, for example, affirmative action. Not Alcoholics Anonymous. This is diversity. So consider, go to camera. Who wants to tackle which question first?
Don't know if everyone.
Well, let me jump in a little bit, and it kind of combines. First of all, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I appreciate that very much.
Welcome.
This idea of egalitarianism and whiteness and betraying whiteness, betraying it for the larger vision of humanity. This is one of those interesting things for me because I am at heart an optimist, and I must have hope. And I remember on the U of O campus a couple years ago when I realized Greg Vincent was leaving and the diversity plan there was getting all this pushback. And there was about 6 or 8 months that I felt like I was without hope. And it was a very disparaging place to be in a time when it was a real challenge to continue to engage these topics because it didn't seem like there was a lot of support other than these good colleagues beside me, people like you and some other folks. So there's a part of me that has to believe that in a hopeful way that, yes, we can do this. There's a real pragmatic part of me that when I talk to people I know and people that are near and dear to me, that I'm not sure if it is. Because people say stuff like, Mac, the great thing about making a lot of money is you make sure the government doesn't get any of that money. When I talk to my mom, and my mom says things like when I'll share with her about the demographics of the country, and she'll say things like, I'm glad that I won't be around when it's majority minority in this country. And things like that, it can leave me filled with despair, but I think that it's like a lot of things for me, that the only way that I can continue to do this stuff and related things like this is this idea that, yeah, if we hang in there long enough and we work effectively long enough that maybe something good can happen. And I know that's naive on my part.
Maybe not. Maybe we have to, look at a different historical precedent.
Yeah.
I mean, South Africa as an example.
Well, yeah, and there's some amazing stuff that's been written out of some of the reconciliation efforts and the hope that folks have talked about from there. So you could argue that if they are able to turn this around, then maybe we could as well. I remember being at a conference and Stephanopoulos was there, and they asked him, so whatever happened to Clinton's race initiative? And he said, you forget, the whole second term we were trying to keep him from being impeached. And that it wasn't, we weren't able to get onto some of these other agendas that we hope to get to. So maybe programs like this and different programs on different campuses, different programs in different communities can get about the business of uncovering, if you will, some of the questions that we need to be talking about. And the questions you've outlined for us, I think, are wonderful questions to engage the city of Eugene, the U of O campus, the Lane campus, and other things like that.
Well, if Tim is the optimist, I'm the pessimist.
Yeah.
And I think the pessimism, which isn't comfortable to live with, but on the other hand, it's really not about me. I think one of the issues that, as you look at your list of folks that you're going to be talking to, I noticed that class isn't in there. And I think, and part of that, I think, is that class has to be a part of all those discussions. One of the things that always strikes me when I do work on race and class is that this isn't working for white people either.
No.
And for a couple of reasons. One, because if you go to the CIA webpage, www.cia.gov,
Right.
and you look at the fact book, and you look under the United States under economy, it'll say almost all of the gains in income since 1978 have gone to the top 20% of the population. Almost all of them. And so if you think about what that means whenever you hear about what the great economy is or how we rebounded from this or we rebounded from that in terms of the actual income and wealth in the country, it's going to a very small group.
Yes.
In addition, and I have to name myself as part of that group, part of the top 20%. If your family income is more than $90,000 a year, you're in that top 20%. The second thing is we fool people about what the middle class is in this country. Yeah. We seem to picture the middle class as being really very well off, whereas the middle income family makes about $50,000 a year, no matter how many people are working. Now, if you layer that with the fact that in this country, with systematic discrimination against people of color, based with housing, with income, with wealth, rules that have actually kept Native Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans from gaining wealth and holding on to wealth. So when you look at class and race together, everybody's hurting except the top 20%. Most of the top 20% is white. I get very pessimistic because people are actually supporting a system that's hurting almost everybody. And that interweaving of race and class, you can't talk about one without the other, is part historically of where we've been, particularly since the 70s, if you want to do recent history. So I get very pessimistic. I brought the Parade magazine from this last week, just to say, where are we ahead and where are we behind, right? Okay, so we're ahead, and we have 460,000 armed forces stationed in 144 countries. This is one of the ways that we're ahead. We have 371 billionaires who are ahead in that. We have 157.88 in gold billion, in gold reserves. But where are we behind? 43 countries have more physicians than we do. 33 countries have a better infant survival rate than we do. 27 countries have a longer male life expectancy than we do. But we do have the highest number of people in prison per capita.
Land of the free.
In the country. And one of the scariest things in terms of a democracy, in terms of it not working, is that of 172 nations who vote, we're 139 in voter participation. That was in the Parade magazine. Now, I read a lot of things, but these statistics don't surprise me, and in fact, I'm glad they're finally in Parade. This isn't working for the majority of Americans, and in terms of Latino Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, other Americans of color, we know that because historically they have been prevented from making the gains that even the bottom 80% of white people have been able to make, that it's hurting the entire country. And I question whether we can continue to have a democracy with an economic race system that harkens back to the Victorian era. So I'm a pessimist.
Well, I choose to be optimistic. I think that it is possible for us to become allies across difference and work towards a better future. I think that for white people, the biggest obstacle is that most white people that I talk to, and myself included up until about 5 years ago, I really didn't understand what white privilege was and how it played out in my life and in my relations and in my story as compared to the other people around me. And since I have become aware of my white privilege and have consciously worked to understand it and work with other people to become allies, I've seen a real shift and a willingness for people that want to come together to listen to each other and figure out how we can create an egalitarian community. The U.S. is kind of big for me to grasp. Just focusing on Eugene, for example, and the Study Circles on Race project, for example, and these little microcosms where people may come into a room having never met each other before, but through the course of time and developing respect and even getting toward trust, revealing more and more about what their lives are like, and a real bond can happen through that. And I think that if that can continue, that we will move toward a more just society. I believe that most of us, although white people have a lot to, our privilege, of course, gives us a lot of good stuff. We get the high end in the wealth gap and the achievement gap and all of that, but it's also harming us and distances us from the community, from other people in our community, and from parts of ourselves that we can't access because our white privilege is like a buffer between us and the rest of the world. So I'm hopeful that if we follow our desire to break out of this social construction that we were born into, didn't ask for, no one explains it to us unless we really ask for an explanation. And then if white people help each other become conscious, then we can come to the table and become allies across difference. And what I've seen is that people of color have been very generous in giving me a chance to show myself as an ally. So that gives me hope.
I wonder if there's a way to be hopeful and realistic. Realistic's the wrong word. And I knew that you'd be on the other side of me.
Pragmatic, perhaps?
Pragmatic, thank you very much for that. I wonder if there's a way to acknowledge both, because I think sometimes we set up this false dichotomy of hope or hopeless and things like that. But because I think Chris's statistics are so telling. And I think that whenever we start talking about class and the situation of many, many people in the United States right now, not just people of color, but also lots of white folks as well, the kind of sense of access to healthcare, access to education, access to all those jobs and things like that you talked about. I wonder what it will take for the tipping point to be reached if you get to that point. It seems like at some point, if people start to really, just like Ruth mentioned before, this grasping of white consciousness, and now you see the world in a different way now.
That's right.
Those stats are so telling that once we have those as part of our, and I know you do, have those as part of your everyday vocabulary, I wonder if we never see the world the same way again.
Well, see, one of the things that I wonder about is, and worry about, is that part of our privilege, I think frequently, is to say, wait a minute, I'm grasping this now. I suddenly feel more grounded around this. And not only that...
The privilege issue. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
And not only that, but Mark and I are friends. And so that must mean the gap is being bridged. And one of the things that Tim always kids me about bringing books. He says that, it's always going to be a problem because he's going to be forced to buy more books.
Right.
But I always have to say, gee, I want to bring 10, so I'll bring 2. But one of them that I brought today is Benjamin Divide's book, The Trouble with Friendship, Why Americans Can't Think Straight About Race. And what I like about this book is it talks about one of the issues that white people have is that we define progress as we're suddenly more comfortable and more in there and more communicating with white people. And this is not to say, Ruth, that's what you meant by
Good, because that's not what I meant.
But I think that for a lot of white folks, that's as far as it goes.
Right.
That we, instead of looking at, we respond to incidents when it happens, instead of saying, what's the pattern of incidents tell us about what the structure is, let's really look for the structure. And we ought to be looking for the structure immediately when we start to see problems. We ought to be saying, what's the structure that keeps this happening? What's the structure that supports this? And so I wonder, along with DeMott, how often we are schooled in the fact that it is enough to be friendly, or it is enough to feel, as a white person, as long as I feel comfortable, there isn't a problem. Right. That's one of the things that I think is goes along with privilege. And the other way I think privilege hurts us is that, along with what Ruth said in terms of separating us from the community, it also creates for, and this is particularly for our children, I think, the idea that they are entitled. And so when they don't get the job, or they don't get the slot at Harvard, or they don't get the slot at the university, they blame people of color because somehow they are entitled. And that's very easy to grow up, even if your parents are not trying to teach you that, in a society that consistently values whiteness over other groups. And so, like DeMott, I worry that we define this whole thing in terms of comfort and friendship, in terms of, instead of what are the structural issues here, where the structure really has to be changed in order for us to make progress.
Yeah. Well, the main point of becoming allies across difference is to deal with the power structures, and to do that together, and through that support more leadership of color in more visible positions, get used to the idea when you're in a room and maybe it's not a white majority room and maybe the leadership is leadership of color, and working together in that way to deconstruct the situation and change the systems themselves. But I think we have to come together as a community to take on the institutions which are so massive and so old that hiring committees, for example, I mean, the way hiring committees often play out, because of the way the social interactions happen, the outcome can often be predictably someone you feel comfortable with, which is probably a white person if the majority of the people on the committee are white. But if it's a actually quite diverse hiring committee and there's allies who are white people there and the outcome is a highly qualified person who is a person of color, then there's another faculty of color. And as that repeats and repeats, the institutions will change. So that's, well, I'm not saying that friendship, I like that book, and I understand the point, and I think that's one of the reasons why this whole issue is so slippery, because there's so many deflections, like, oh, but I have a friend who's a person of color, so I get it, and it's just, it's so much more elaborate than that, and so much deeper than that, and I think working together with white people to call us each other on that kind of stuff will help snap us out of those simple answers and go toward the hard, long haul, which is actually to renovate basically the whole power structure of this country. That'll take a while.
Yeah. I mean, the use of the term renovation and power structure. There's so many different ways we can go with this because, I mean, for example, Ruth mentioned hiring committees, of which, being, I'll say it because it's cable and I can. Okay, so being an A-list Negro in town, and yeah, that is partially self-deprecating, but also speaks to a certain reality, right? Chris gave me my first gigs in training with the state when she was the state A&D training director, right? Not because I was black, though that was, value added perhaps to the larger system, not necessarily to her boss, but because I demonstrated capability that came from being the son of a black doctor, and I knew A&D stuff, and I'd work with gangs, and there was a piece there that was sorely missing in our industry. That is, okay, you need to combine street wisdom with medical terminology and be able to break it down to people in a particular way with some skill, right? So when I encounter people make an appointment with Mark Harris, the drug counselor at LCC, and they listen to me over the phone and they haven't seen this television show or any of my other shows, they're expecting to see, and I kid you not, because this is a quote by more than several people, all coincidentally Oregonians, white Oregonians, oh, you don't look the way you sound over the phone. Right. And so I, play with them and say, oh, I look taller. And she goes, yeah. And I said, okay, and this is like in front of two people of color from my ethnic studies class. And, okay, let's play this out. What do I look like in your mind? Yeah. Well, 6'5", blonde hair and blue eyes. And I basically say, okay, at that point I got to stop this and just say, oh, right, well, I'm trained to sound white, but my voice is black at the roots, right? And she blushes, and I go, okay, so here's a piece, okay, about how power is granted and who has it. Right. Okay, and being an A-list Negro means usually that you're part of a white organization, you've been hired, and generally the experience, my experience here, being hired here, and also for the 11, now 10 black people that have been hired at LCC out of a total of 30 in its history, which means less than one a year, all right, that we're not hired because we're black. We're hired because we're so much better on paper and demonstrated skill in the interview than the nearest qualifying white person, that it basically is stupid to hire us because you're going to lose money. So they get that kind of skill because some of us have been trained old school to say, okay, in order to be even considered equal in a hiring situation, you have to be twice as good as the nearest white candidate. And that's how you survive, and that's how you get over. That is a form of power in which you basically can enable, just like Peg McIntosh talks in that seminal paper about invisible knapsack. If you know the code phrases, if you know the map, if you know the code phrases to get you through the gatekeepers and up to the layers, through the glass ceiling and the sticky floor, which are all structures, and all of you have talked about the structures of power and making them invisible. So maybe the renovation is not necessarily, as I thought in my youth, tearing the whole system down, but structurally renovating it so people can make their own doors.
Well, let's talk about renovation. I mean, Ruth's point about the hiring committee, where if the committee is mostly white, you're likely to end up with a white person that everybody's comfortable with. If you go to the root of what part of the problem with that is, it's going to be that in the first place, we didn't specify the skills and the abilities that we're looking for. And we didn't say ahead of time, this is the bottom line. We're not looking for comfort. We're looking for the ability to do this. We're looking for the skill to do this. We're looking for the experience. You're right. When I hired you because I had lots and lots of people who wanted to do teaching and learning or teaching and training, but very few people that could handle physiology and could explain it in an easy way. I think that one of the things as I work on hiring issues at U of O that comes up is that as we say we want every person who works at the university to be able to work effectively, respectfully, inclusively with people from diverse languages, cultures, etc. So if we put that in the jobs, and we're starting to put that in the jobs, then we need to be able to say for every specific job, what does that mean? Right. And we need to be able to say, if this person is a faculty member, what does that mean for behavior we expect in the classroom? If this person is in financial aid, what does that mean for behavior we expect for the person in financial aid? And we ought to be able to spell that out ahead of time, advertise for those skills, and then the committee ought to be held accountable for looking specifically at those skills. Because if we're honest about that, the likelihood is that people who have really put some thought into this, which would be skilled professionals of color and skilled white folks who are allies, are going to have an edge. That's how you restructure. Because you were saying renovation. We renovate. We hope we don't renovate because we go to the store and go, oh, look, I can get a new $100,000 kitchen. We hope we renovate because something is broken and needs to be fixed.
Right.
Right.
Or is inadequate.
Is inadequate, is not meeting our needs. And I would suggest that the hiring, the way that we have historically done it, is not meeting our needs.
Yes.
Very frequently, no matter who we hire, we haven't looked specifically enough at skills. And so we hire nice folks, but they don't have what we need. And if we were looking honestly at what we need, we can't afford at U of O a faculty member who's going to teach in a disrespectful way to students from all over this country who are white, who are of color, to students who are from all over the country. We can't afford in financial aid or in the registrar's office to have folks who can't work effectively with students from all over the world. We can't afford that. So, that's just one renovation we could make, two hiring. That I think we're gradually moving in that direction. That would be better for everybody. How delightful it would be to always work with people who have the skills and abilities that you need in the job.
And I mean, I think that's really critical because, I have to acknowledge that you did help this institution deal with that because having been in lots of hiring committees where, you're reading apps or you're dealing with applicants who, usually stereotypically white men, whose basic diversity, their answer to the diversity question is, I had a black friend in high school.
Right.
Over and over again. Like, okay, that qualifies you with friendship, but no, what about skills? What we're looking for is a white man that has designed and delivered programming for people of color, therefore has knowledge, skills, and abilities demonstrated in your resume. Can you deal with that. You know, and other, you know, and there are some out there. There are quite a few out there. So when we talk about, you know, that conversation that we had at that was kind of had at the U of O around cultural competence, it's, well, okay, it's not about excluding white folks. It's about, do you have the skill to deal with difference? And that changes depending on what the difference is. It's skill-based.
And where that falls out in the hierarchy of what you're looking for. If that's one of the first three things as opposed to the thing at the bottom of the list.
Right.
I think that one of the things, too, that gets interesting with that when it becomes more behavioral based or experientially based, you want solid evidence of that. You don't just want, I had a friend, or I have a neighbor, or I have a pastor in our church who was a person of color, or I know somebody from the LGBTQ community or something like that. I think one of those things to have people operationalize, be able to articulate that in resume, cover letter, and then be able to speak skillfully and knowledgeably about that. It's not just, do you believe in diversity? You know, that time is long gone. It better be a given anymore. But you've got to be able to have the set of experiences and skill set to work with a broader population than I think we've had to before.
Well, it seems to me, too, judging from the people that I've talked to in this community and elsewhere, that I'm going to generalize, most white people really haven't thought about this very deeply. Maybe when it comes to a job and that question comes up and how am I going to answer that question, but in terms of really examining the history of this country and the contradictions from the birth of this country and how, you know, all men are created equal, but we have slaves. Well, how do we work this out? I guess some of us are more equal than others, and you know,
some of us are 3/5 of others.
Yeah, right. And grapple with this together, because we were also born into this as, you know, I'm a child born into a society not knowing, you know, given a role, not knowing the history, not knowing why I should be treated any differently than anybody else. And there isn't much in the society that reflects that back. In fact, in McIntosh's article, she talks about that a lot. It's invisible. We're taught not to see it. And she started to make that list of her privileges. And in the article, she says, I had to write it down because I kept forgetting what they were, because it just goes right out of your head. So here we are talking about wanting to make major changes to move toward a society that is centered on multiracial values. That's the way I feel. That's what I yearn for, to expand, to heal the community, to grow and learn from each other. I just get excited just at the thought of it. But a lot of people haven't even taken the prerequisite steps, which are, what is my role in this community? How did I get this sort of power? And if I do have some sort of power by virtue of my skin, what would I do with it? And actually, I've had several people just in the last couple of weeks, white people, say to me, but my family and I are kind of comfortable, so why would I give that up? And I admire their honesty. I mean, I admire their frankness about saying, hey, I'm fine. Why would I change the circumstances? But the answer to that is what all this is hinging on. And for me, it's, well, I don't know who said this, but I love this quote. Anything that diminishes the humanity of any of us diminishes the humanity of all of us. But we're so used to thinking individualistically, well, my bank book's cool, I got a nice house, I don't even know the rest of those people in those statistics, you know. We managed to keep ourselves away from that. We're not thinking collectively. We can carry on enjoying our white privilege without ever changing anything. But if we can help each other to think collectively, to understand that we are connected to our history going back, whether or not, you know, as you said, Bubba's ancestors owned slaves or not, we're still receiving those benefits. But we have to dig pretty deep and work pretty hard and be very courageous to do the work.
And the history of the state, not just the history of this nation, but the history of the state's problematic.
The state, absolutely.
Well, and I think that one of the problems with that, if we're talking about things that need to be renovated, is the way that history is taught. You know, Manifest Destiny gets picked up because a newspaper editor, in talking about the movement toward taking over parts of Mexico, says Manifest Destiny. Then that gets picked up in Washington in order to describe the movement west, period. I can remember learning manifest destiny and thinking it was a little strange. You know, unfortunately, I had parents who would take that on and talk about how strange it was. But when you think about manifest destiny, you think, okay, so God-given right to take over the entire continent. Does that really make a lot of sense? But it helps even more then to break it down and say, so what happened to the different peoples as we moved? And so not only do you have, you know, the obvious things, which is, you know, indigenous folks who are moved off of their land, who are told basically, don't hunt, you have to farm. Oh, by the way, you have to do it over here, and oh, we're going to move you all over here, and we prefer it if you'd walk. But in addition,
In the cold.
yes, in the snow, yes. But in addition to that, I mean, we can think about that historically, and we go, well, that happened back then. But in addition to that, the tribal peoples now sit on land that controls oil, that controls coal, but they don't have control of those. Because from a paternalistic standpoint, and this goes back to that white man's burden thing, we can't give them control. And so even though we have, you know, managed to take over almost all of the land and do it for the most part illegally, and not somehow think that that's a problem because it's in the past. If you look at what's going on right now with Native peoples, we don't let them control even the small amounts of land. And now when they make money with casinos, we have a fit. Oh my God, they're successful. We can't have that. You know, 98% of the loans that went out from the FHA after World War II went to white people. So you could come back as a veteran, but you couldn't take advantage of housing. You could come back and get the GI Bill, but if you were a person of color, except for a few historically black colleges, you couldn't get into college. So you couldn't use that benefit. The two bulwarks that build the middle class in this country after World War II, housing and education. You know, suddenly after World War II, unlike before World War II, the majority of the white population, more than half, start to look at college as a serious possibility and own their own homes. But everyone of color is basically excluded from that. And for the most part, up until the 50s, Asians continued to be excluded. Native Americans continue to be excluded. And we keep, study after study after study shows that we systematically deny Latinos and African Americans. And so we're not talking about ancient history. We're not even talking about earlier American history. But if we don't even know the early American history, if we do know that, but then we say, well, this is over, we're not even looking at where we are currently. And so I think one of the renovations is look at where it is, because it's not helping anybody to basically be in denial of what are the conditions under which we all live.
It seems like one of the conditions of whiteness, to the degree, well, we can describe it and y'all can describe it, and there are lots of writers that can describe what that is. One of the ongoing conditions of that seems to be a sort of cultural amnesia.
Yes.
Okay, like you've eloquently described the structures, two of the key structures that keep people from achieving wealth, you know, the whole socioeconomic status. And I didn't want to get into that because it's a big topic to get people's minds around, but housing and education, okay? Your ability to have a house is based on how much money you make, which is directly related to your level of educational attainment. So unless you know, make the grades or have supplements, and basically I was raised by, you know, I'm a generation or two away from sharecropping and 3 generations away from slavery. In slavery, our folks said, okay, we got to read because they don't want us to, and they don't want us to for a reason, so we're going to teach ourselves. And, you know, not just the Bible, everything. Not just their version of the Bible. You know, there's another one that we remember. So what is that? So when you talk about the annexation of Mexico, you know, I teach this in my ethnic studies class. The second president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, outlawed slavery throughout all Mexico, which included all the Spanish named states. Okay? So we wanted to continue slavery, and there were some white folks in Texas, Tejas, that wanted to keep their slaves and petitioned to the United States government to go against war against Mexico to maintain slavery. And it was, basically, John Quincy Adams that decried that practice. It's not even about liberty, it's about maintaining slavery, y'all. So what are you saying? So that's how we annexed Mexico, to maintain slavery. And so that's another story about, okay, so what is this condition that keeps us from remembering that? Some of our things, in answer to the question, why do white people hate us, right? So since the majority of students taking my class are white, it's like, okay, y'all need to learn our history because it's humans' history, but what was once done to us for race is now being done to you for the money. So a lot of things start in Oregon. It's not just, whipping black people every 6 months until they leave the state. Even black people who were citizens of the United States in another state couldn't come to Oregon. Y'all had to leave. Bye. See you later. All right? While white foreigners were encouraged from Europe to come here. Right? So the concept of, we dealt with last week in Natives about Turtle Island is North and South America with many nations, many languages, no borders. Who is it that needed borders? Who is it that needed these categories? Are you aware that the Moors enslaved millions of Europeans? You are aware of that. But that wasn't taught to you in school, was it? Okay. So, is this payback? Was American slavery payback for something that isn't even being taught as history because it doesn't go with a narrative of white people being, the progenitors of civilization and democracy and, enlightening the benighted masses? I mean, so there is a larger story that isn't being told that could provide some seeds for that renovation. You need a context for that renovation to happen.
I remember teaching a graduate diversity class, and one of the things I found after the first year of teaching it was the students didn't have a historical background to what had happened in this country. And so we got Takaki's book, and it may not have been the greatest book in the world, but it was a great foundational piece, and they said everything made more sense because we read that than it ever would have. And we had history undergrad majors who said, we never learned this stuff as a major. And and it just seems like, how can you understand what's going on currently if you don't have at least some basis for that? And Chris is wonderful about the stats and things like that, and tracing the historical kind of progress or non-progress, but the historical roots of some of the stuff that is so powerful and it's still with us today.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really, again, as a pessimist on the panel, if you look at the study that Marion Bertrand from the University of Chicago and Sendal Mullainathan did from MIT, where, and this is just a couple of years ago, where they sent out, because they were in Boston and in Chicago, they did it mostly there, but they sent out thousands and thousands of resumes. And the only difference on the resumes was some of them had names like John Smith, and others had names like Jamaica Smith. And what they found out was that any African-American sounding name,
LaQuisha or whatever, LaRon,
Deshonda, any African-American sounding name, no matter what the person's credentials, had to put up 50% more resumes in order to get an interview, had to try 50% more. And this is with everything else being the same. And that it didn't matter, extra education didn't balance that off. Extra experience did not balance that off. Even neighborhood affiliation didn't balance that off. Now, if where we are in the United States is that a name, the perception of a name of being African American is all it takes for us to lessen employment opportunity. If that's where we are. There was a study in the New York Times this past weekend that said that immigrants of color do far worse in the United States than immigrants that are perceived as white right now, today, across all of these different areas, housing and employment. If that's where we are, then, as Ruth and Tim said, we need to look where we are. Because that's not the promise of the country. That's not what we say we're about.
No, it's a very hypocritical situation.
Other renovations, or let's see. It's going to come up. So, affirmative action is a current topic. There's the ballot initiative happening in Michigan. I was called by a radio station to comment on the fact that it's probably going to come here in the fall. I tried to explain to class, no, this is not unfair advantage. This is basically simply asking for a lane on the track and a fair start with everybody else. Period. End of discussion. We still have to do our training. We still have to do our preparation. We just want a lane on the track with everybody else.
Fair enough.
If you're talking about affirmative action as it's used in employment,
yes,
then it seems to me that that stems from a basic misunderstanding of even what affirmative action is, right? Because all that affirmative action, the executive order 11247, I think, says is that we will look to see where you recruit and for what you're recruiting. We will look to see who are the people that are qualified according to what you're defining as qualified in that area, and how many of them are African American and Latino. And then we will look at your labor force and say, okay, for people that have those kinds of jobs, how many of them are? And if we're even within 80% of those two numbers, we're okay. But if we're not, we have to recruit more widely. Not we have to hire somebody in particular,
right?
But we should make a good faith effort to go out, because clearly if 15% of the people in our recruitment area are people of color and are qualified, and 2% of the people in our institution that have that job, and in terms of U of O and Lane Community College, I'm being generous by saying 2%, then there's a mismatch that doesn't happen by chance. Now, does it mean we're not recruiting enough? It could be. Does it mean that we have some hidden barriers in the job description? We put some things in there that we're asking for a bachelor's degree, something the university is famous for. We're asking for a bachelor's degree for a job that's an office manager, or for some other level job where you could easily gain those skills without a bachelor's degree. Then that's what we need to look at. That's all affirmative action is in hiring. And for the life of me, since we are talking about getting more qualified people, it mystifies me that that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at that problem from Lane's point of view, my particular hire in my cohort, right, 1992, 44 open faculty positions. Our local area is the nation. Right? Not Oregon, the nation for faculty and administrators, etc. So 44 faculty hires, 1,400 applications, 160 of those apps minority, so 11%, decent, pretty close to the numbers. They hired me as the sole minority hire, which you crunch the math, 3 standard deviations from chance. So it is not an accident that, we have the racial composition at this college that we do. It is impossible, for example, if you want to have Spanish, since a third of language teachers generically are native speakers. So if that means Spanish, a third of them. And we're on the West Coast, so statistically it should be impossible to have a lily white Spanish department, as an example. Right? So, and a past chair here, he's gone, been gone for more than a decade, said, well, Hispanics don't really work out in this department. And now they have more, which is to their credit. And I work in a department that's probably the most diverse on campus, counseling. But we made the effort to do that, to look for skills and abilities, and hey, a gay Latino man who's done battered women's shelter. Yeah, I think we want him for counseling. Yeah, that would be good. That's a no-brainer. But talking about affirmative action in the last 4 minutes that we have in hiring, we talked about in hiring, but in school admissions. I think, and this is what I'd say, you know, on the radio, look, you want to eliminate affirmative action, make college mandatory and accessible for everybody. No restrictions anywhere. Just do that, like high school. End it.
Accessible meaning affordable?
Accessible, affordable. It is part of national security that you go, and we will pay.
Well then, but before that though, the first thing you have to do is make sure that the K-12 system actually educates people.
Right.
And as we keep taking money away and keep promising people vouchers for private schools that don't exist, so it's kind of a shell game. Benjamin DeMott and others have talked about the fact that the school system is deteriorating, and we're letting it do so because the top 20% can send their kids to school any place they want.
Final thoughts? We got a minute. Eh? Yeah.
Well, we didn't talk too much about the social construction of race, but I just thought I'd drop that in there about how race doesn't exist as a biological reality, but racism does and privilege does. So my favorite quote is from Charlie Hill, an Indian comedian. He says, "White isn't a race, it's an attitude." So I guess we should just, check our attitude.
Two things real quick. A friend of mine once shared the opinion that it's easy to be liberal in the suburbs. When I moved to Eugene, I had a different impression of what Eugene was like than what it turned out to be, because the X-Files articles were in the paper the first week that I moved here, and it was interesting.
Exit files,
Yeah. So what goes with that then is, I think, one of the great challenges and one of the great needs that white people need to do is to shut up, to listen, and to believe when people of color talk.
30 seconds? Okay, thanks.
I've said enough.
Okay, all right. Wow, that hour went quick. So thank you for watching. Tune in next time on the 5th when we consider African American perspective. This has been DiversiTV. See you in the future. Go well, stay well.